Hello, this is Talia Pesitsky from Swedish Jewish Dialogue. Once again, SJD is located in Jerusalem, and this time with StandWithUS. And I have in front of me Michael Dixon. How are you today?
Great to be with you. Thank you for coming to us.
Thank you, sir. Now, could you please tell us a little about StandWithUS? Who are you? What are you?
So StandWithUS is all about Israel all the time. We were set up back in 2001 in the dark days of the Intifada, when buses were blowing up and cafes were blowing up here in the streets in Jerusalem, and yet out in the worldwide media people weren't getting the message. They didn't really understand what was happening. So StandWithUS was set up to be an education organization to help activists and particularly students and young people to reach out to other people, telling Israel's side of the story, making sure that people get the full information, the full facts, because often there's a lot of misinformation that gets in the way.
Yeah, I see. That's very interesting. But more about your mission. Could you go into more details?
Absolutely. So we were established in Los Angeles back in 2001, and since then we grew across the United States and across the world. From here in Jerusalem, we coordinate all of our activities around the world. Wherever we set up, we have an office that deals with campuses and the community, and we have educational materials that help people understand more about Israel. We believe that education is the road to peace. That means that we need to educate our young people, and we need to have them reach out to other young people all across the world. So we're very active on social media. We reach about 1.1 million people a week on Facebook alone. We send out educational materials all around the world in a wide variety of different languages. We have very good website resources. We counter BDS, what's called the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, the groups that are targeting Israel in many different ways, trying to enforce a commercial boycott or a cultural boycott on Israel. We try and reverse that wherever we can. We encourage people to buy Israeli goods and to learn more about Israel so they can teach more about Israel. And we do it at the grassroots particularly, because we believe that people connect to people, and people have so much influence nowadays. I don't think there's been a generation that has so much personal influence at their fingertips that they can reach out to other people. So we try and get young people engaged, and activists of all ages engaged in supporting Israel, learning more about Israel, teaching more about Israel, and acting on that, standing up and forming counter-demonstrations when there are anti-Israel demonstrations, and helping businesses that are being targeted by boycotts, and writing back to newspapers and getting information out there. That's what we're all about.
Good that you mentioned BDS, because I was about to ask you about it. You as SJD, you're against BDS. It's mostly because they boycott. Do you see this as a threat as they boycott Israeli goods?
I don't know that the threat is so much that actually boycotts will take place. Anti-Israel groups want to try and enforce a boycott because they want the impression of Israel as a place that should be boycotted. So it's really a kind of reputational thing. This is an informational war. It's a kind of soft war against Israel, a drip of misinformation and lies being said about Israel, so that they'll see and be able to portray Israel as a place that should be boycotted. So our aim is to make sure that people see through that and understand that that's really just propaganda, and understand what Israel really is. Because Israel is by no means what they portray it to be. So it's less about the actual boycotts. I don't think actual boycotts are happening so much, and I don't think they're really affecting Israel that much. I think it's more a reputational thing. And we have to stand up for Israel's reputation. We who know what Israel is really like must stand up for Israel's reputation and defend her, so that we can have people understand what the real face of Israel is.
Good. But there are many organizations that actually claim that Israel is a apartheid state. Why is that so?
Well, the reason they claim it is because they want to do Israel down. There are some people, unfortunately, that their waking thought is, how can I mess around with Israel today? What new lie or what new campaign can I form against Israel today? They make a comparison between apartheid, and what we therefore need to do is have people understand what apartheid really is. There are a lot of people living in this world who never knew apartheid South Africa. They weren't alive then. Young people in university now, don't know what apartheid South Africa was. So what the bad guys, the BDS guys, are hoping for is that someone will hear apartheid in Israel and think, wow, that makes sense, and they'll buy into that. So what we have to do is shine a light on why that's wrong. Apartheid South Africa had a legally legislated segregation between blacks and whites. No, they didn't sit on the same benches. They didn't drink from the same water fountains. They went to separate schools. They had separate establishments. And it was a really indoctrinated and legally legislated racist state. Israel is nothing like that. Anyone who steps off a plane and walks on the streets in Israel, here in Jerusalem, sees a multicultural, diverse society. And unfortunately, we can't bring everyone in the world to come and see Israel. That would be the best thing if we could. So instead, we need to shine light on what Israel really is. Israel is diverse. Israel respects all religions. Israel respects all peoples. Israel is the only place in the region where you can be a minority religion. It's the only place in the region where Christians are flourishing. It's the place in the region where refugees flee to, not away from, right? And it's a place where you can, respect all different lifestyles. It's a place where there is a very flourishing gay community. It respects women's rights. So we have to talk about these things about Israel, so that when people throw a slur, they just throw a lie like apartheid at Israel, we can bat it away with the truth, with a true picture of what Israel really is.
Yes, indeed. So, but Stand With Us is a Zionistic organization, but there are different views on what Zionism is. How do you define Zionism?
I believe that if you believe that Jews have a right to a nation state, and you believe that that nation state should be in their historic homeland where they've lived for thousands of years, where they are the indigenous people, then that makes you a Zionist. It's as broad as that. You can be Jewish, you don't have to be Jewish, it doesn't matter. But if you agree that there is this one tiny strip of land in this world, in 193 countries in the world, there's always one place that is historically and has always been historically Jewish, and that Jews have a right to live there in freedom and security and peace, that makes you a Zionist. And I think that we want to empower more Zionists, more people to understand that and support that viewpoint.
I noticed that you have some story of the soldiers. Can you tell us more about them? Maybe you can tell us also a story, a little story for us?
I mean, we have a program that's really doing great called Israeli Soldiers' Stories. And we set this up back when there was the campaign against Hamas in Gaza in 2009. We saw so many groups that were misinterpreting what was happening and deliberately trying to blacken the name of the IDF. And so we set up this group called Israeli Soldier Stories for people to do just that. They videoed themselves, they put them up on YouTube, and they told their stories from their own combat. Men, women, all different types of soldiers. As you know, in Israel we have mandatory army service. It's the Israel Defense Forces. This is a tough neighborhood and people need to defend their own country, and therefore everybody serves in the army. So there are lots of stories, and we just wanted to create a way of telling them. First we did it on the internet, and now these guys go on speaking tours all around the world. And we had some amazing things we understood. Because what essentially is happening is young people are serving in Israel's defense forces and squaring off against the worst kind of terrorists, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. And whereas our guys have something called the purity of arms, they are taught how to behave as a soldier in a moral way. They are fighting against an army that is not in uniform. They're fighting against terrorists who will hide in schools and hospitals. And we had so many stories. We had one soldier who was engaging with Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorists fighting against Israel. And a truck drove onto the battlefield, and out of the truck came kids. And these kids were like 10, 11 years old, were holding toy guns, okay? So somebody had got these kids into a van, given them toy guns, and said, come, we're going to take you to play somewhere, and literally dropped them off into a battlefield so that it would either stop the IDF shooting one of them, or that somebody would be shot by accident, they could blame it on Israel's army. I mean, these are stories that people don't know about, and yet this is what Israel faces, because it's not fighting another army of the same kind, it's facing terrorist fighters who really don't have any morals, and really don't mind how they fight and who they endanger, even if they endanger their own side. And we hear that again and again. We had one of our soldiers who was a Kravi fighter, a combat soldier, who went to capture a senior Hamas terrorist, and found that his house had missile launchers, one of them next to a crib. this is the kind of thing that we're facing. We're facing a very virulent, extremist, terrorist groups that our young people have to go and fight against in order to defend their people back home, because that Hamas terrorist was in charge of ordering rockets to be launched from Gaza into the south of Israel, targeting Israeli men, women and children. So for us, we want these stories to be heard all around the world, and we want people to relate to these young people as ordinary people, which they are, who just happen to serve in an army because we live in a tough neighborhood and we have to defend ourselves.
Why is so that Israel's neighbors has such a anti-Israeli direction?
I'm not convinced that everyday people in all these surrounding Arab countries think badly of Israel. Actually, I think many of them think extremely well of Israel. I think many of them are jealous of the way that Israelis can live their lives, and many of them are jealous of the way that Arab Israelis can live their lives of freedom here in Israel. I was with a Syrian who was here on a very covert trip, and we went to visit a university campus. And at some point, we were walking in the courtyards of the campus here in Israel, and there were Arab students praying. They were kneeling over and praying. And he was amazed at the freedom that these young people had to pray here in Israel. And I was like, of course, that's how it is. But he didn't realize that. And I think that when our Arab neighbors do realize that, they're actually jealous of our freedoms. Look, where would you rather be an Arab right now? Look at what's going on in Egypt. The whole, it's a flame. Egypt is a flame. You look at Syria, where so many have been massacred and so many have been cast out as refugees. You look wider at the region, and it's a sea of dictatorships. And unfortunately, for generations, those young people have been indoctrinated to hate Jews and Israelis. It's a major problem. The only thing that we can do is to reach out to people, have them understand that Israel genuinely wants to live peacefully in its homeland with all its neighbors. And hopefully, at some point, that will be understood. People talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but really it's a whole Israeli-Arab conflict. It's the whole region that we need to look at, and it's a tough situation we find ourselves in. But, we've survived this long, we'll continue to.
This group, Nutrikarta, I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Nutrikarta, yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's mostly a group of religious Jews that are against the state of Israel. How come?
Well, I actually wouldn't call them religious Jews. I think they're crazy, quite frankly. First of all, let's bear in mind we're talking about a very, very small number of people. They're beyond a fringe group. They're a very, very small number of people. They're people who ideologically believe that Israel shouldn't exist. And in order to do so, they align themselves with Iran and with the most radical elements in the Palestinian society like Hamas. So the Nutrikarta really represent no one. They have no real constituency. They're a very small group. And I think they're crazy, because what they essentially are doing is aligning themselves with the worst of Israel's enemies. So their ideology is really so extreme. I'm not even sure they're worth us wasting our time about, but they do a lot of damage. They do a lot of damage because people who see them, they dress like they're religious Jews. Most religious Jews of any type do not support Nutrikarta.
I agree with you. Now, one of my favorite questions. UN, United Nations.
Yes.
Why do they view, like they view today, such anti-Israeli? Why are they against Israel? I mean, it's crazy.
It is crazy. Look, when we see the UN, and particularly the UN Human Rights Council, we see how many times it votes against different human rights abusing countries, and we compare that with Israel, and there's no comparison. Israel is the one that is held in the dock so often, and the other human rights abusing countries, not only are they ignored, but they sit around that Human Rights Council, and that really is the issue. The UN, at the end of the day, is made up of the multitude of nations, and there are many nations that are intrinsically anti-Israel. There's only one Jewish country in the entire world. There are dozens and dozens of Arab countries, and they're supporters. And unfortunately, that sometimes reaches to the Security Council, where you have Russia and China who are ambivalent, not always supportive of Israel's position or the West's position in general, and therefore the UN for a long time has been a hotbed of anti-Israel activity. It's very much skewed against Israel. Israel does not get a fair hearing in the UN at all. We know the famous Zionism is racism resolution that was then revoked, but that memory lingers. Okay, the fact that the UN cannot really see Israel in a fair way impacts a lot of what the UN does, and it's very hard. I've been with the UN delegation, the Israeli delegation to the UN in New York. They do great work, they do great outreach, they have a lot of friends within the Western countries and some other countries as well. But there will always be a majority of countries against Israel, so it's very hard for them to make any headway.
Okay. Now going back again to StandWithUS, do you have any upcoming events or projects coming months or?
Yeah, so right now our Israeli soldiers are touring all across the United States. We've just done a tour of UK campuses as well with a victim of terrorism called Kay Wilson, who's done a very important tour. We have a very important office in the UK. We're now branching out to do more in Europe, also more in the Far East is going to be a focus for us this year. And we're doing some great events as well in Australia and South Africa. We just had a group of Arab Israelis and other Israelis who came together to go and reach out to Canadian campuses just now, where there can often be a lot of anti-Israel activity. And we're going to be doing more Buy Israeli Goods Days this year that happen all around the world in every country, where people can buy Israeli goods and help support Israeli businesses in the face of these kind of boycott activities that we saw. So it's going to be an exciting year for us. Here in Jerusalem, we're actually moving our office to a new office and educational centre in King David Street, opposite the King David Hotel, and that's going to allow us to see many more groups. I mentioned all the people we're engaged with on social media, but here in Israel we also educate many thousands of international students coming here on birthright programs and tourists and business groups, and we work with Israelis as well to train them to be better ambassadors for their own country. So there's a lot more to do this year. We're looking forward to the challenge of supporting Israel all around the world, and I'm really pleased that you came to see us today to learn more about us. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much, and thank you to our supporters. You know who we are. This was Talia Vesitsky from Swedish Jewish Dialogue. Shalom from Jerusalem.